China had calculated that Taiwan's diplomatic isolation would prevent international intervention. However, Beijing's latest maritime maneuver has triggered the largest coordinated naval response in the Pacific since the Cold War. On March 8, 2026, Chinese warships established a permanent blockade formation stretching 340 kilometers across the Taiwan Strait, effectively cutting the island's primary shipping lanes. Within 72 hours, 17 U.S. Navy vessels converged on international waters surrounding Taiwan, creating what Pentagon officials are calling an iron ring of deterrence. This is not a routine freedom of navigation operation. This represents the most significant military standoff between nuclear powers since the Cuban Missile Crisis, with $4.2 trillion in annual global trade flowing through waters that have suddenly become a potential battlefield. The images you are about to see on your screens reveal the scale of China's unprecedented maritime aggression. What you see is not a military exercise. The footage shows the permanent deployment of Type 055 destroyers, Type 052D guided missile destroyers, and at least 12 submarines forming what Chinese state media calls a reunification enforcement perimeter. But that is not the most shocking detail. There are three factors that transformed this from regional tension into global crisis. The first is China's deployment of anti-ship ballistic missiles on artificial islands within the strait itself, creating overlapping kill zones that theoretically deny access to any naval force. The second is the coordinated economic warfare campaign that began the same day, targeting Taiwan's semiconductor exports that power 92% of the world's advanced chips. The third is the diplomatic bombshell that emerged 48 hours later, when leaked communications revealed China's ultimatum to Taiwan. We will explain this in the later parts of the video. Now we must look at how this crisis erupted. On the night of March 7, 2026, satellite imagery captured by commercial reconnaissance systems showed unusual Chinese naval movements departing from 3 separate fleet bases. According to reports from the Institute for the Study of War, the simultaneous departure of capital ships from Qingdao, Zhanjiang, and Yulin Naval Base represented the largest coordinated deployment since the 2022 Taiwan crisis. By dawn on March 8, these formations had established fixed positions, creating what naval analysts describe as a strategic choke point. The strait location you see on the screen, measuring just 130 kilometers at its narrowest point, carries 48% of global container shipping and represents the primary route for energy supplies to Japan and South Korea. Chinese destroyers positioned themselves at precise intervals, creating radar coverage that blankets the entire strait. According to preliminary data from U.S. Pacific Fleet Intelligence, the formation includes at least 32 surface combatants, supported by shore-based anti-ship missile batteries on the Fujian coast and newly constructed positions on Pingtan Island. The timing was calculated with precision. March 8 marked exactly 24 hours after Taiwan's president concluded a state visit to Washington, where she addressed a joint session of Congress and received commitments for $12 billion in additional military aid. Beijing had warned of severe consequences. The naval blockade represents China's answer, but the truly sophisticated element is not the ships themselves. It is the integrated weapons systems they carry and the tactical doctrine governing their deployment. Let's examine the technology that makes this blockade so dangerous. The Type 055 destroyer, China's most advanced surface combatant, carries 112 vertical launch cells capable of deploying YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missiles with a range of 540 kilometers. Each destroyer can simultaneously track and engage over 100 targets using its Type 346B active, electronically scanned array radar system. According to analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a single Type 055 possesses greater anti-air warfare capability than the U.S. Navy's Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. China has deployed 6 of these vessels in the blockade formation. The Type 052D destroyer, of which at least 14 are present, adds another 768 vertical launch cells to the formation's combined firepower. These ships carry a mix of anti-ship, anti-air, and land attack cruise missiles, creating what U.S. naval planners call a layered defensive bubble that would require overwhelming force to penetrate. But the surface fleet represents only the visible threat. According to German intelligence reports, China has deployed between 10 and 15 Type 093 nuclear attack submarines and Type 039 diesel-electric submarines in the Strait approaches. These submarines employ advanced air-independent propulsion systems that allow them to remain submerged for up to 3 weeks without surfacing. The Type 093, equipped with YJ-18 submarine-launched cruise missiles, can strike targets over 500 kilometers away while remaining undetected beneath thermal layers that complicate sonar detection. The submarine deployment creates an underwater kill zone that any relief force would have to navigate. The combination of surface ships, submarines, shore-based missiles, and aircraft creates what Chinese military doctrine calls an anti-access area denial system. This is the A2AD strategy that Pentagon planners have feared for 2 decades, now deployed in real-world operational configuration rather than theoretical war games. The shore-based component amplifies the threat significantly. According to Radio Free Asia reporters embedded with Taiwanese defense forces, China has positioned DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missiles and DF-26 intermediate-range ballistic missiles on the Fujian coast, directly across from Taiwan. These missiles, traveling at hypersonic speeds approaching Mach 10, are designed specifically to target aircraft carriers. The DF-21D, nicknamed the carrier killer by Western analysts, can strike moving naval targets at ranges exceeding 1,500 kilometers. Intelligence assessments suggest China has deployed at least 200 of these missiles within range of the Taiwan Strait. The DF-26, with its 4,000-kilometer range, can reach Guam and the U.S. naval facilities that would serve as staging areas for any relief operation. This layered missile architecture creates concentric threat rings that force any naval response to operate under constant threat of ballistic missile attack. This tactical deployment creates immediate operational paralysis for Taiwan. The island nation depends entirely on maritime trade for energy supplies, raw materials, and food imports. Taiwan maintains strategic reserves of fuel and grain sufficient for approximately 90 days under normal consumption patterns. However, the blockade does not merely restrict future imports. It has trapped 47 commercial vessels currently in Taiwanese ports, unable to depart through the Chinese naval cordon. According to Taiwan's Maritime Bureau, these vessels carry $3.8 billion in cargo and represent 15% of the island's active merchant fleet. The economic impact extends beyond immediate trade disruption. Taiwan's semiconductor foundries require constant resupply of ultra-pure chemicals, rare earth elements, and specialized manufacturing equipment. According to industry analysis from Taiwan's Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, production facilities can maintain current operations for approximately 6 weeks before critical supply shortages force production slowdowns. After 12 weeks, manufacturing would face complete shutdown without resupply. The blockade creates cascading consequences throughout global supply chains. Taiwan produces 92% of the world's advanced semiconductors below 10 nanometers. These chips power everything from smartphones to fighter jets, from automobiles to data centers. Major technology companies, including Apple, Nvidia, and Qualcomm, depend entirely on Taiwanese semiconductor production. According to economic analysis from Goldman Sachs, a 3-month disruption of Taiwanese chip exports would create $500 billion in economic losses globally and trigger recession in technology-dependent economies. The automotive industry, already fragile after years of chip shortages, would face immediate production shutdowns. The smartphone industry would exhaust existing chip inventories within 6 weeks. Cloud computing providers would be unable to expand data center capacity, creating bottlenecks in the digital economy that supports $15 trillion in annual economic activity. But China's strategy extends beyond economic pressure. The blockade creates a direct challenge to international law and the principle of freedom of navigation. The Taiwan Strait is an international waterway where ships of all nations possess the legal right of innocent passage. China's blockade violates this principle by claiming territorial waters extending across the entire strait, based on the assertion that Taiwan is a renegade province rather than a separate entity. This legal framework creates a dilemma for international shipping. Any vessel that attempts to transit the strait must either acknowledge Chinese authority by requesting permission or challenge the blockade and risk interdiction. According to maritime law experts at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, this represents China's attempt to establish de facto sovereignty through coercive presence rather than diplomatic recognition. The global response began within hours of the blockade's implementation. Japan, which depends on the Taiwan Strait for 60% of its energy imports, immediately deployed maritime self-defense force destroyers to positions just outside the blockade perimeter. According to Japan's defense ministry, 4 Kongo-class destroyers and 2 Otago-class destroyers established a monitoring presence in international waters, creating what Japanese officials call an observation line. South Korea, facing similar energy supply vulnerabilities, dispatched 3 Sejong the Great-class destroyers to parallel positions. The coordination between Japan and South Korea, historic rivals now united by common threat, represents a diplomatic shift that Beijing had sought to prevent through decades of divide-and-conquer diplomacy. Australia announced deployment of 3 Hobart-class air warfare destroyers to the Philippine Sea, creating a southern monitoring position. The Quad nations, India, Japan, Australia, and the United States, held emergency consultations and issued a joint statement condemning China's unilateral action and affirming the principle of freedom of navigation. The European Union response revealed the depth of global concern. On March 10, 2026, the European Parliament passed an emergency resolution with 87% support, declaring the blockade a violation of international law and threatening sanctions on Chinese entities involved in the operation. France announced deployment of the aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle to the Indo-Pacific, with an expected arrival in the region within 3 weeks. The United Kingdom committed the HMS Queen Elizabeth carrier strike group, currently in Singapore, to extend its deployment and maintain presence in the South China Sea. Germany, historically reluctant to engage in Pacific security issues, announced suspension of high-level economic dialogue with Beijing and froze approval for Chinese investment in critical infrastructure projects. This European engagement in a Pacific crisis represents a geopolitical realignment that China's strategists had dismissed as impossible given Europe's economic dependencies. NATO, though formally focused on European security, held emergency consultations at the North Atlantic Council level. According to leaked minutes reported by Politico, Secretary-General discussed potential invocation of Article 4 consultations, acknowledging that an attack on critical economic infrastructure affecting member states could trigger collective response mechanisms, while Article 5 collective defense applies only to attacks on member territory. The economic warfare dimension of the blockade affects NATO economies directly. The alliance stopped short of military commitments, but issued a statement affirming that the rules-based international order applies globally, not just in the North Atlantic region. The statement carried implicit warning that NATO capabilities could be deployed in support of international law, regardless of geographic location. Now let's turn the camera to the most critical response. The United States Navy reaction has been swift and overwhelming. Within 24 hours of the blockade's implementation, the USS Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group, previously operating in the South China Sea, moved to positions 200 kilometers east of Taiwan. The carrier, accompanied by 2 Ticonderoga-class cruisers and 4 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, established a defensive posture that places its FA-18 Super Hornets within striking range of Chinese naval formations. According to U.S. Pacific Fleet announcements, the USS Carl Vinson Carrier Strike Group departed from Pearl Harbor on emergency deployment, with an estimated arrival in the Western Pacific within 9 days. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, previously scheduled for Middle East deployment, received orders to divert to the Pacific, creating a 3-carrier concentration that has not been seen since the peak of the Iraq War. But carrier strike groups represent only the visible American response. According to Pentagon sources, at least 5 Virginia-class nuclear attack submarines have deployed to the region, though their precise locations remain classified. These submarines carry Mark 48 torpedoes and Tomahawk cruise missiles, providing subsurface strike capability that can engage Chinese vessels or shore installations without surface ship exposure to Chinese missile threats. The subsurface dimension creates strategic ambiguity that complicates Chinese targeting calculations. B-52 strategic bombers from Andersen Air Force Base in Guam have begun continuous patrol missions armed with AGM-158C long-range anti-ship missiles capable of engaging surface targets from standoff ranges exceeding 900 kilometers. The bomber presence creates an additional strike vector that Chinese air defenses must account for, stretching their coverage and creating potential gaps. The U.S. Marine Corps has deployed additional forces to Okinawa and the Philippines, including F-35B Lightning II stealth fighters capable of vertical landing operations from expeditionary bases. According to Defense Ministry statements from the Philippines, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement locations have received Marine Littoral Regiment units equipped with naval strike missiles and unmanned systems for intelligence gathering and strike missions. These distributed forces create what Marine Corps doctrine calls stand-in forces, positioned inside Chinese weapon engagement zones to provide targeting data and conduct sea denial operations. The concept represents a shift from traditional power projection to a more resilient, distributed posture designed specifically to counter Chinese anti-access strategies. The logistics mobilization reveals American intent to sustain operations indefinitely. According to Military Sealift Command reports, ammunition ships, oilers, and dry cargo vessels have begun surge deployments from West Coast ports to support extended Pacific operations. Pre-positioned equipment stored in Japan, South Korea, and Guam is being distributed to forward positions. The logistical preparation suggests not a short-term show of force, but a commitment to long-duration presence that can outlast Chinese operational tempo. This brings us to the most crucial question: what are the human dimensions of this crisis, and how are decision-makers calculating the risks? Inside Taiwan, the population faces the reality of isolation for the first time in the island's modern history. According to Taiwanese polling conducted by National Chengchi University, 73% of citizens support resistance to Chinese coercion, but 54% express concern about the economic impacts of prolonged confrontation. The Taiwanese government has begun rationing fuel and implementing emergency food distribution protocols. Supermarkets in Taipei showed panic buying in the first 48 hours of the crisis, with rice, cooking oil, and canned goods selling out across the capital. The government's strategic reserves are being released to prevent hoarding and price gouging, but the psychological impact of potential shortage creates social tension. The President has addressed the nation 3 times since the crisis began, projecting calm determination while acknowledging the severity of the situation. Her approval rating has surged to 78%, the highest level since her election, suggesting national unity in the face of external pressure. The Taiwanese military has mobilized reserve forces and positioned anti-ship missiles, air defense systems, and coastal artillery to defend against any amphibious assault. However, military strategists acknowledge that Taiwan cannot break the blockade through its own capabilities. The island's navy, consisting of 4 destroyers and 8 frigates, cannot contest Chinese naval superiority in the strait. Taiwan's strategy depends entirely on international response, particularly American intervention, to maintain its lifeline to the global economy. This dependence creates psychological vulnerability that Chinese strategists are exploiting. Beijing's state media broadcasts emphasize Taiwan's helplessness and the futility of resistance, attempting to erode public support for confrontation. In Beijing, the leadership faces its own calculations. According to analysis from Chinese military observers, President Xi Jinping's decision to implement the blockade represents a calculated gamble that American resolve will falter when confronted with the potential costs of military confrontation. Xi's consolidation of power over the past decade has positioned him as the paramount leader whose legacy will be defined by the Taiwan question. The blockade allows China to apply maximum pressure without crossing the threshold of actual invasion, which would trigger automatic American military response under the Taiwan Relations Act. This gray zone operation tests American commitment, while providing off-ramps if the pressure becomes counterproductive. However, the strategy creates its own trap. If the United States does not back down, Xi faces the choice of escalating to military action or accepting a humiliating retreat that would undermine his domestic authority. Chinese economic vulnerabilities complicate Beijing's calculations. According to trade data from China's General Administration of Customs, the country remains dependent on international markets for food imports, energy supplies, and technological components that domestic production cannot replace. A full-scale conflict with the United States would trigger financial sanctions, technology embargoes, and trade disruptions that could destabilize China's economy. Youth unemployment already stands at 21.3%, creating social pressures that the Communist Party struggles to manage. The property sector collapse has erased $3 trillion in household wealth, and local government debt exceeds 130% of GDP in many provinces. A major international crisis could trigger domestic instability that threatens Communist Party control. These internal pressures create incentives for resolving the Taiwan crisis through negotiated face-saving measures rather than military escalation. In Washington, President faces the most consequential foreign policy decision since the end of the Cold War. According to reporting from the Washington Post, the National Security Council has presented three options. The first is diplomatic de-escalation through international pressure and economic incentives that give China a path to withdraw without losing face. The second is sustained military presence that demonstrates commitment to Taiwan without directly challenging the blockade, essentially accepting a new status quo while preventing further Chinese aggression. The third is freedom of navigation operations that directly challenge the blockade by escorting commercial vessels through the Chinese cordon, creating the risk of military confrontation, but establishing the principle that international waters cannot be unilaterally closed. Each option carries enormous risks. Diplomatic retreat could encourage Chinese aggression and undermine American credibility throughout the Indo-Pacific. Sustained presence without action could be perceived as weakness despite the military deployment. Direct challenge could trigger shooting war between nuclear powers with incalculable consequences. American domestic politics complicate the decision. According to polling from Pew Research Center, 68% of Americans support defending Taiwan, but only 42% support military action if it requires U.S. combat casualties. This gap between abstract support and concrete commitment creates political vulnerability for any president who leads the nation into conflict. Congressional leaders from both parties have made hawkish statements demanding firm response to Chinese aggression, but these same leaders would face political backlash if military action produces American casualties or economic disruption. The president must balance international credibility against domestic political survival, strategic necessity against popular opinion. The coming days will determine whether this crisis becomes the defining confrontation of the 21st century, or a managed de-escalation that resets great power relations. According to intelligence assessments, China's blockade can be sustained logistically for approximately 6 months before crew rotation requirements and maintenance cycles force partial withdrawal. Taiwan's strategic reserves provide 90-day buffer before critical shortages emerge. The United States can maintain current force posture indefinitely given its logistics capabilities. This timeline creates a window for diplomacy, but also a countdown toward crisis points where economic pressures force decision-making. Several scenarios could trigger escalation. An accidental collision between US and Chinese vessels in the crowded waters could spark shooting that neither side intended. A Taiwanese fishing vessel attempting to break the blockade could be sunk by Chinese forces, creating martyrs that demand response. A miscommunication or misidentification could lead to weapons release that triggers counterstrikes. In an environment where dozens of warships operate in close proximity, hair-trigger alert status, and political pressures for decisive action, the probability of unintended escalation increases with each passing day. History shows that great power wars often begin not through deliberate decision, but through accident and miscalculation that leaders cannot control once violence begins. Yet there are also pathways to de-escalation. Back-channel negotiations through intermediaries could produce face-saving compromises that allow both sides to claim victory while stepping back from confrontation. China could declare the blockade a successful demonstration of capability and withdraw forces while maintaining increased patrols as new normal. The United States could propose international mediation under UN auspices, creating multilateral framework that dilutes bilateral confrontation. Taiwan could offer political concessions short of reunification that give China symbolic victories without surrendering sovereignty. These diplomatic solutions require both sides to prioritize long-term strategic stability over short-term political advantage, a calculation that becomes more difficult as domestic audiences demand strength and compromise appears as weakness. The global economy watches with mounting anxiety. Stock markets have experienced 12% decline since the crisis began, wiping out $4.8 trillion in market value. Oil prices have surged 23% on fears of supply disruption if conflict spreads. Semiconductor stocks have crashed 31% as investors price in production disruptions and potential destruction of Taiwanese foundries. The volatility reflects recognition that this crisis could trigger global recession or worse if military confrontation disrupts trade routes, destroys critical infrastructure, or triggers broader conflict. Central banks have prepared emergency liquidity measures, but monetary policy cannot solve geopolitical crisis. Only diplomatic resolution or deterrent stability can restore confidence. This is not merely a regional dispute over a contested territory. This is a fundamental test of the international order that has governed global affairs since World War II. The principle that borders cannot be changed by force, that international waters remain open to all nations, that economic coercion cannot substitute for diplomatic negotiation, these foundations of global stability are being challenged. If China succeeds in coercing Taiwan through blockade, the precedent will encourage aggressive actions by other revisionist powers. If the United States fails to uphold its commitments to Taiwan, allies throughout Asia will question American security guarantees and potentially seek accommodation with China rather than risk abandonment. The stakes extend far beyond Taiwan to the credibility of alliances, the enforcement of international law, and the balance of power that shapes great power behavior. The next chapter of this crisis may be written at sea, in negotiating rooms, or in the corridors of power in Beijing, Washington, and Taipei. The world holds its breath, aware that decisions made in coming days could determine whether the 21st century sees great power peace or devastating conflict. The iron ring that the US Navy has created around Taiwan represents both deterrent against Chinese aggression and potential flashpoint for catastrophic escalation. General Winter is not coming to this theater, but the cold calculations of nuclear-armed powers create their own deadly freeze that could shatter into violence with single miscalculation. What began as a Chinese attempt to coerce Taiwan through naval pressure has evolved into the most dangerous great power confrontation since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The images you have seen on your screens show not just ships and missiles, but the potential for war that could reshape global order or destroy it entirely. Don't forget to share your thoughts on this critical situation in the comments section. Do you think diplomacy can resolve this crisis? Or are we witnessing the opening moves of a larger conflict? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like our video. The Taiwan Strait has become the focal point of 21st century geopolitics, where the ambitions of rising power collide with the commitments of established hegemon, and where miscalculation could trigger consequences that dwarf the intentions of any leader. China set out to isolate Taiwan and force submission through economic strangulation. Today, Beijing finds itself in a confrontation with the combined naval power of the democratic world, where the blockade it imposed may become the cage that traps its own strategic ambitions. Only time will tell whether wisdom prevails over pride, whether compromise defeats confrontation, or whether the waters of the Taiwan Strait become the graveyard of the peace we have known. Presented by TGN. Thank you for choosing us.